lies and smears and slander.
A damn liar, man. That's not true.
A bunch of lies, grievances, and name-calling.
Me, as other millions of people watching the political battle on September 9th, Trump-Harris debate, it was a shit show.
They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets.
I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
Oh my god, this guy is a clown. While watching it, I couldn't help but think about how deeply politics and finance intertwine, especially in today's world. The rhetoric, the accusation, it all boils down to one fundamental truth. Power is not just about political, it's mostly about financial. That moment inspired me to get a better understanding of the hidden world of how governments, corporations, and individuals use financial leverage to manipulate global events and accumulate more assets and wealth, and how these global events eventually affect us, the final customers. You are watching debates and wondering about what party are you gonna vote for? Who of these two could potentially better impact your well-being? Sadly, we will never know, as the history has no subject line. However, in the end, we will closely talk about current events, debates, and both administration. The inspiration for today's video is a book, the book that uncovers these uncomfortable truths. The New Confession of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. Despite being a controversial source of information, the book spent more than 70 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. I was an economic hitman. My job was to convince countries to take on huge debts that they could never repay, to use those debts to control them, and to funnel their resources to the rich elites. John Perkins. A few words about the author. John Perkins is a former economic hitman who worked for a consulting firm in the 1970s. His job involved convincing developing countries to take out massive loans for the large infrastructure projects, knowing that they could never repay the debt. In his book, Perkins exposes the world of economic hitmen, or HAMs, highly paid professionals who work for corporations. The job of HM is not to help the country but to cripple it financially, making it dependent on foreign corporations and governments. The result, the country's resource policies and even its future are controlled by those who orchestrated the loans. Speaking about it, you should understand that it's a rule of life, that nothing comes from nothing. If someone has a wealthy life, it means someone on the other side of a globe getting poorer.
Right, people lose homes, people lose jobs, people lose retirement savings, people lose pensions. You know what I hate about fucking banking? It reduces people to numbers. Here's
A power and wealth of a particular country directly depends on its ability to generate its own resources, as well as extract resources from the other countries, no matter of its form. It could be a workforce or energy resources. Speaking of Perkins, who himself admits of being part of the system, and in his book he explains how HMs operate in the shadows to achieve these goals. Economic hitmen are highly paid professionals who cheat countries around the globe out of the trillions of dollars. They funnel money from the World Bank, the US Agency for International Development, and the other foreign aid organizations into the coffer of the huge corporations and the pockets of the few wealthy families who controls the planet's natural resources. Their tools include fraudulent financial reports, rigged elections, payoffs, extortion, sex, and murder. Alright, let's talk about HAMs or economic hitmen. Basically, they use financial tools like loans, aid packages, and development deals as strategic weapons to exert control over developing countries. On the surface, these financial tools are presented as opportunities for economic growth and prosperity. Countries are encouraged to take out massive loans to fund the construction of the highways, power plants, schools, and other infrastructure projects. However, the reality is far more sinister. These projects are often intentionally overpriced, poorly planned, or just unnecessary, which leads to unsustainable levels of debt that the recipient's country is just not able to pay. Once a nation trapped in these financial strangleholds, it becomes vulnerable to the demands and interests of foreign powers, particularly the Uncle Sam and multinational corporations. Let's take Ecuador example. In 1970s, the country was persuaded by HMs to accept enormous loans to develop oil extraction infrastructure, with the promise that this would be fuel for the country's economic growth. However, much of the loan money went into projects that didn't benefit the average Ecuadorian citizen. Instead, it lined in the pockets of the foreign contractors and local elites who collaborated with the Western interests. The debt burden eventually became overwhelming. As Ecuador's debt grew, the country had no choice but to meet the demands of its creditors, most of whom were tied to Americans' financial institutions. To repay these debts, Ecuador was forced to sell off its oil resources at low prices to American oil companies like Texaco and Gulf Oil. This extraction, while being profitable for foreign corporations, caused environmental devastation, particularly in the Amazon region. Wealth that was promised to benefit Ecuadorians instead fell into the coffers of multinational companies, while Ecuadorians remained impoverished and dependent. Next example is Panama, under General Omar Torrijos. In the 1970s, Panama, like many Latin American countries, was courted by HAMs and offered loans to develop its infrastructure. However, Torrijos resisted these economic pressures, seeing them for what they were, an attempt to gain control over Panama's resources, especially the Panama Canal. Torrijos was a nationalist who fought for Panama to regain control over the canal from the United States, and he refused to allow his country to fall into the debt trap that HAMs were laying for him. His defensive action came at a great cost. In 1981, Torrijos died in a suspicious plane crash, and many suspect that his death was not accidental. Resistance to foreign control and his outspoken opposition led to Western corporate and financial interests made him a target. The death of Torrijos has a parallel with the deaths of the other world leaders who have resisted the demands of the economic hitman, including Ecuador's Jaime Roldos, who also died in a suspicious plane crash in 1981 after resisting similar pressures. It's just a few examples. Perkins also mentioned the famous invasion of Iraq in 1990, also known as the Gulf War. This is what he said about it. In the case of Iraq, we HMs failed. Our attempts to bring Saddam Hussein into the fold through economic pressure and deals had failed. Therefore, the jackals went in. But they too failed to get him out of the power. They left only with the one option: send in the military. If you're really interested in this topic, I highly recommend the movie Jarhead, which tells the story about Iraq invasion, also known as Gulf War, from a perspective of an ordinary Marine in 1990s. So, how about individuals involved? Perkins described working with the powerful CEOs and politicians, names we might not hear today, but who shaped the fate of nations in their time. These individuals profited greatly, while the countries they targeted were left with the debt and poverty. Many of them moved to secure more power and wealth through political and corporate ties. Alright, now we're moving to the most interesting part of the video: war in Ukraine. The tactics John Perkins talks about in his book aren't just a thing of the past. They might be happening right now in the war in Ukraine, just like Ecuador or Panama, when countries were pursued and manipulated, and perhaps the same kind of strategy is being used here. Western countries, especially the US, have given Ukraine billions in loans and aid, while at the same time they have put heavy sanctions on Russia. Don't get me wrong, what Russia did is terrible, and going with the war to a neighbor is ridiculous. The question is, what does it mean? One of the main reasons behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in my opinion, centers on the eastward expansion of NATO. Russia has consistently viewed NATO grow towards its border as a direct threat to its national security. The possibility of Ukraine joining NATO was especially provocative for Moscow, igniting long-standing fear of encirclement by Western military forces. Before the invasion, Russia demanded legally binding security, guaranteed from the Western that Ukraine would never become a NATO member. These demands were not fulfilled to Russia's satisfaction, and escalating tension to a boiling point happened. It's crucial to highlight that the United States is NATO's primary sponsor, significantly influencing the alliance's policies and direction. The goal is pretty clear: to hurt Russia's economy and bring Ukraine closer to the West. The US, under the Biden administration, is giving Ukraine financial help to make sure they follow Western political and economic interests. In other words, Ukraine might be expected to build stronger ties with countries like US and possibly allow NATO or US military bases. But what are you counting on when you're trying to fight a country with a nuclear power? I just feel sorry for Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Unfortunately, it seems to me that Ukraine might be a bargaining chip for NATO and the US to defend their political interests regarding Russia. It's kind of like a modern version of the economic hitman strategy Perkins describes, but on a much bigger scale. The stakes are a lot higher now, and because it's not just about money, it's also about military power and global politics. By helping with the money and weapons, the US is making sure Ukraine becomes a stronger ally while Russia gets pushed further into isolation, both economically and politically. Obviously, there are more reasons for Russia to start the war against Ukraine. Russia has always seen Ukraine as a part of its own influence. Russia feels threatened by NATO expanding eastward, especially if Ukraine were to join. There are also historical and cultural ties that make Russia feel like they're losing control over an important neighbor, especially with Ukraine's strategic location and resources. Alright, you're probably thinking, man, what the fuck are you talking about? It sounds pretty delusional. And here we're moving to the most interesting part. Alright, let's talk about this man, Hunter Biden. For those who follow in the news, you might know that on September 6th, Hunter Biden pleaded guilty to tax-related charges as a part of broader investigation into his financial dealings. Drama is unfolding here, and while Hunter Biden has admitted to tax manipulations, this plea allows the rest of the legal process to occur behind closed doors. This means that Joe Biden's name, which likely appears in the case, will not be mentioned publicly. Alright, the leak of Hunter Biden laptop, which were exposed to public in October 2020, revealed that it was actually Joe Biden who received a percentage from his son's schemes. Hunter Biden, serving on the board of the Ukrainian gas company Burisma and the Chinese private investment fund, earned $7 million in Ukraine from 2016 to 2019. A kickback from this money was allegedly made to Joe Biden, an arrangement that is being kept from the public eye.
I don't know what he was doing. I know he was on the board. I found out he was on the board after he was on the board, and that was it. And there's nobody...
Well, you've had a lot of time. Isn't this something you want to get to the bottom of?
No, because I trust my son.
Here's the deal. From my understanding, Hunter was sitting on the board of Burisma, one of the Ukrainians' biggest natural gas companies. Any questions? He doesn't exactly have a PhD in energy, more like, hey, I know the guy kind of expertise, and he was raking a pretty nice salary while doing it. Naturally, this raises a few questions. Was he hired because of his mad energy skills? Or was it because of his last name happens to be Biden? The thing is, while investigators are still digging through Hunter's business records, we can't help but ask, how much of these good old-fashioned financial manipulations at the highest level? Is this another case of powerful people working the system to get ahead, like the kind of story John Perkins described in his Economic Hitman book? It's the kind of drama that makes us wonder what else could be in the Hunter's playbook. How much money has been made for clever behind-the-scene deals? I mean, who knows? But it's definitely stirring up conversation about ethics, power, and how the world of business and politics really works. And hey, at the end of the day, we're just seeing a small part of the bigger picture. Who knows what else has gone down? Okay, let's wrap up. Now, let's bring it closer to the United States. The US government has spent billions supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. While this might seem like a distant issue, it has real consequence for regular people in US, Russia and Ukraine. Increased defense spending, which estimate about 200 billion, means higher government debt, which ultimately results in inflation and higher taxes. I'm not talking about thousands innocent people who died on the battlefield from both sides for the ideas of their leaders. When the US government decides to send military or financial aid to Ukraine, it usually doesn't take the money from a saving account. Instead, the government borrows the money by selling treasury bonds to investors. These investors can be foreign governments like China or Japan, domestic banks, or even individuals. When the US sells these bonds, it's essentially promising to pay back the money with interest in the future. This borrowed money is then used to finance aid packages for Ukraine. However, by issuing more treasury bonds, the government is increasing the national debt, which as of 2024 is already in the tens of trillions of dollars. More borrowing means the government will need to spend even more money later to pay off the loans and interests, putting more strain on the federal budget. The Federal Reserve, or also known as US Central Bank, plays a big role in managing the economy, particularly with inflation. When the government borrows heavily, it can contribute to inflation, since there is more money circulating in the economy without corresponding increase in goods and services. To combat inflation, the Federal Reserve might decide to raise interest rates, for instance.
The Federal Reserve, an independent government body, can influence the available supply of credit and thus interest rates by changing the rate they charge banks to borrow money. Interest rates can impact a wide variety of economic elements. They can be lowered to try and jumpstart a faltering economy and lifted to curb inflation.
All right, when interest rates go up, borrowing money becomes more expensive. What's the impact? First of all, it's mortgages. Home buyers have to pay more interest, making home ownership more costly. Some say that higher interests lead to lower prices for housing, but unfortunately, we haven't seen it in the past few years. Prices for property went up, and it's pretty controversial. However, I would highly recommend checking out the channel of the former trader, Gary Stevenson, and his video about the future of the house pricing. He gives detailed explanation of why the prices for property will keep rising and what ordinary people like us should do with it. Next thing is car loans. The car loans become more expensive to finance a vehicle. Credit cards. High interest rates mean bigger monthly payments for people carrying credit card debt. Business loans. Companies face higher costs when borrowing, which can slow down their investment and hiring, for instance. Obviously, on the other side, some sectors are going to benefit. Let's talk about, for instance, defense contractors. When global tension rises, companies that make military equipment and technology often experience a boom. The increased demand for weapons and defense system can send their profits and stocks prices through the roof. There's been talk about politicians investing in these defense giants. While members of Congress are required to disclose their financial trades, it's crucial to check official records to separate facts from fictions. We should always be cautious of unverified claims floating around in social media. And you know, these wars going to end sooner or later. After the dust settles, the focus shifts to rebuilding. Companies specializing in construction and even infrastructure step in to help restore roads, buildings, and utilities destroyed during the conflict. These firms often secure lucrative contracts funded by international aid packages, leading to substantial profits. Meanwhile, regular Americans feel the squeeze from higher interest rates. Borrowing costs go up for things like home loans, car loans, and credit cards, putting more pressure on household budgets. On top of that, as the national debt increases, future generations could face higher taxes or cuts in essential services like healthcare, education, and social programs, as more government money goes towards paying off that debt. I was talking a lot about Biden administration and Democrats, but how about Republicans? Flip side, the Trump administration and the Republicans Party might not have been as economically efficient at something. For example, their response to the COVID-19 pandemic faced criticism for delays and mixed messaging, leading to prolonged lockdowns and higher unemployment rates. This directly impacted regular Americans who lost their jobs or had to close their businesses. Moreover, the massive stimulus checks and financial aid provided during the pandemic increased government spending significantly. While these checks offered immediate relief to many, they also contributed to the rising inflation, which we're experiencing now. Pumping more money into the economy without matching increase in goods and services can drive prices up, affecting everyone's cost of living. So, what does all of this tell us? Whether we're talking about Hunter Biden's financial dealings, the war in Ukraine, or the everyday struggles of Americans, the common thread is clear. Financial manipulations and political power are deeply intertwined. This debate made me think about the future of the country and financial well-being of a regular citizen. I'm not judging anyone, but rather thinking about facts. You don't need to have an unbelievable knowledge in economy to use your critical thinking, right? Just check out this tweet of German ex-hacker and businessman.com. He actually thinks about efficiency of the current administration under the Biden, especially in the perspective of the war in Ukraine. If you want to understand more about how global finance shapes our world, I highly recommend checking out Perkins' book. I also check out Gary Stevenson's channel, where he speaks about economics of inequality. Make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think about the role of finance in shaping today's global conflicts. When the walls of denial come crashing down, we are left with two choices: remain complicit in a system of exploitation, or become an agent of change. John Perkins.
I was an economic hitman. And we economic hitmen have created a new global economy, really, a form of capitalism that I call predatory capitalism. It isn't working. We all know this. The oceans are rising. The glaciers are melting. Less than 5% of us live here in the United States, and we consume almost 30% of the world's resources, while half the world is on the verge of starvation, or actually starving. That's not a model. China can't do it. India can't do it. They're trying, but they can't do it. We have to change. We have to have a revolution. We must change the system.